So Dr. Mark Anderson directs the Nature Conservancy Center for Resilient Conservation Science, which provides science leadership, ecological analysis, and landscape assessments for conservation efforts across 50 states. He holds a Ph.D. in ecology from the University of New Hampshire and has worked as a conservation scientist for over 30 years. Over the last decade, Mark led the effort to identify and map climate resilient land and waters across the continental US and has published widely on climate resilience, landscape dynamics, and biodiversity conservation. In 2017, Mark received the Nature Conservancy's Conservation Achievement Award, and in 2021, he received the Land Trust Alliance's Kingsbury Brown Conservation Leadership Award. Please welcome Mark Anderson.
It's great to be here today. Thank you, Lisa, for the invite. I'm really excited to talk and hear the other speakers. And already, I don't even know what to say on top of Reed's remarkable presentation and Ryan's great information. I think we'll be reinforcing a lot of the same concepts. So I titled mine Radical Resilience in Wild Carbon. Hopefully it gets your attention and you'll see where that leads. This is our I work for the Nature Conservancy, as you heard, director of the Center for Resilient Conservation Science. Our ecoregion map, this is the Central Appalachians, and I'm going to focus a lot of today's talk on the Central Appalachians. And it's broken into really two parts. First, I'll talk about site resilience, and the ideas of conserving nature's stage and connected microclimates and connectivity. And then we'll switch gears over to carbon, and we'll talk a little bit about the science of trees, and then we'll look at carbon stock and sequestration in the Central Apps. So should be fun. And please, write your questions. I'd be happy to talk as we go. My own adventures in the Central Apps and thoughts on resilience actually begin with a lot of time spent. This is Dolly Sodd's time in the field spent with Rodney Burgess, who always, I don't know if you know him, he was the former TNC state director for West Virginia. And he would always tell me the Central Apps is the most diverse ecoregion in the Northeast. It was part of the Northeast region at the time. And Rodney's has the frustrating habit of always being right. But I kept thinking, well, how could we test that? How could we test Rodney's thought and see if that would be true? And we worked out a way to actually test it. We don't know the species richness of an ecoregion, but we do know the species richness of most of our states. So what we did was we collected from NatureServe state by state information on the number of birds, mammals, herptiles, all the vertebrates, also the number of plants, and then the number of macroinvertebrates for every state. And then we also calculated for every state a whole bunch of climatic variables, like the means and the minimums and the maxes for diurnal temperature, annual temperature range, annual temperature, annual precipitation, temperature during the coldest month, precipitation in the warmest quarter, all sorts of climatic variables. I was thinking maybe we can predict how many species are in a state based on their climatic variables. But we also brought into this model some geographic variables, elevation, latitude, area, and also some geophysical variables like the number of geology classes and the different types of geologies and the number of landforms. We put all of these things into a model thinking if we could figure out what are the best predictors of diversity in a state, then we could transfer that to an ecoregion, and we could also think about what climate variables we really should be focused on. So to make a very long story short, I ran every possible model using 1 to 4 variables at a time, and every possible combination. And most of the models were terrible, but there was a set of models that was amazingly good. And then you could figure out what are the variables that when they are in the models, you start to get great results. And the variables turned out to be all geophysical. The number of geology classes, the amount of limestone, the latitude, and the elevation range. The climate variables really did not come into play. And the best model out of all the selected ones are the ones you see here, which we published. And here you can see that you can predict the number of species in every state in the East with almost 94% accuracy just by knowing how many geology types, the amount of limestone, and the latitude. We published this in a paper called Conserving Nature's Stage, and we argued that what this is telling us is that biodiversity is an expression of the geophysical diversity of the land. It's the characteristics of the land that create diversity in the first place. And that even as the climate changes and species move and change, these properties will persist in places that are rich with geodiversity. And we went later on to play with this across all the eastern states you can see here. And we looked at it for plants and vertebrates and invertebrates, and it held up. And this idea that places are important really sort of sold me on the realization that conservation of places is critical under climate change. And we have to find places that represent the full geodiverse spectrum if we want to sustain all of nature into the future. I did go back after this and do the modeling for each ecoregion, and lo and behold, Rodney was right. The Central Appalachians did have the most predicted species richness, 7,452 species of all the northeastern ecoregions. As we got deeper into the idea of conserving nature's stage, and we started thinking about building our conservation portfolios around geophysical diversity, we also started to get deep into the idea of resilience. How can we determine places on the landscape that are more likely to maintain species and persist under changing climates? And once again, that science brought us back into the properties of the land, and it brought us into this world that I call connected microclimates. Now, most climate models that you see are modeling regional climate, and those models are cool and they're useful, but species like plants and animals and people, we really are responsive to much more local climates. And all of you have seen scenes like this where you see, a slope at the end of, in the late spring, you've got snow that hangs on the north facing slope, and the south facing slope is dry as can be. Or in shrublands, you can see the shrubby, moister north facing slope has a whole different vegetation than the south facing slope. Or you might have seen pockets of snow that are in little cold hollows or canyons, and even big wet basins where it gets cooler, that properties are cooler around that basin. What you're seeing is a large temperature and moisture range built into the landscape. And sometimes these temperature ranges can be 10 to 15 degrees different than each other, which is more difference than we're expecting in climate change. And the landscape itself does not have to be highly diverse in order to have a lot of these microclimates. They're really called topoclimates and moisture differences built into the landscape. I'm really surprised that this has taken so long to sort of get a hold in the science. It's starting to really get a hold in the scientific literature. There's 2 textbooks written on this, one is called The Climate Near the Ground, and another is called Boundary Layer Climates, because it's a very well-known phenomena that the climate near the ground is quite different than the climate a little higher up, and that the way Earth reflects heat, the way moisture is distributed, and the way topography distributes creates a lot of climatic difference in the ground. So we got hooked on this idea of let's find places that have a lot of climatic differences, because those are places where species can persist. From the point of view of species, you can think of them as refugia. We call them climate resilient sites because we think they might change, but they will retain these properties. And we tested this in a lot of ways. So here's one test you can see in the blue here. We got 178 timber rattlesnake dens, and we plotted out, they're located on the ground, and we plotted out where they're located. And you'll see they're all located in the hottest part of the landscapes. They're usually on south-facing slopes, usually right where you get the highest amount of solar radiation. They like heat, but there's some range in it. You can see there's some range in it. And then if you plot out, here's another plant, mountain bugbane. It's really a cove specialist. If you plot out all the locations of that species, you'll see they're mostly on the cold, moist, wet, cool parts of the landscape. So where you find species like this together in the same landscape, they are virtually living and existing in very different climates. And this land itself actually contains lots and lots of different climatic options. And these places are the places where we think species can persist for a long time simply by moving locally. As Reed mentioned, local microclimatic buffering can allow species to stay in the landscape for a long time. Maybe not forever, but for a long time. So the transition becomes much slower. Well, we spent 10 years trying to map microclimates, and we finally came up with really great models for mapping microclimates and then measuring the amount of microclimates available around every point on the landscape. And I'm not going to go through how we did that modeling, but what I want you to see is when you model that out for the US, the center of microclimatic diversity is in the Central and Southern Apps. That is the place. Here's a zoom in for the East. And you can see on the left, the Central and Southern Apps. The green on this map, yellow is average, brown is below average, and green is above average. And you see the microclimatic diversity popping out in the Central Apps. We also looked at connectedness, and you'll see that the connectedness, how locally connected areas are, the center of that was more in the Northern Apps, but also the Southern Apps also had a lot of connectedness. And when you're actually looking for connected microclimates, the Central and Southern Apps pop out as really one of the real centers of connected microclimates in North America. So it's just built into the landscape itself. Now, of course, that microclimate diversity has long been known because it's the reason we have so many endemics. We have this ecoregion has so many species based on all the geophysical diversity and so many endemics because of this microclimatic, not microclimatic buffering, the microclimate diversity on the landscape. And I love Annie Dillard. She nailed it in this quote that I'm putting here, where she says, "Life is a gloss on geography. And if you dig your fist into the earth and you crumble geography, you strike geology. In Virginia, the salamanders vary from mountain ridge to mountain ridge. So do the fiddle tunes the old men play. That's because it's hard to move from mountain to mountain. These are not merely anomalous details. This is what life is all about." Thank you, Annie. So in the Nature Conservancy, we've been advocating for conservation of those climate resilient sites, which this Central Apps is full of. And if species can persist and thrive in these sites, they're going to be reproducing. And ultimately, they are going to be dispersing and moving. So we do have to think about the movement. It's not just climate resilient sites, but it's movement from one to the next. And how are we going to keep things moving? The movement of species, even trees, is already well documented. I love this study by Fay et al. That came out a few years ago. They looked at 86 tree species in the East and found that on average, they were moving about 10 miles north per decade and 11 miles west. I mean, that's a lot of movement for tree populations. Obviously, it's new trees recruiting on the end. But if you look at this wacky little circle I put in here, one of the other take-home messages is they're all moving independently and not necessarily all in the same direction. So how do you think about connectivity, sort of omnidirectional connectivity, and how do we keep the landscape permeable in order to let nature move and thrive? Well, we've addressed that using a great new software called CircuitScape. It's not that new anymore. This is a map created with CircuitScape, very coarse scale, where it's just trying to map the movement of 125 mammals, birds, and amphibians, sort of where they would have to move to stay in their climatic envelope at a much coarser scale than what we were just looking at. We like this technology a lot because it lets you think about movement in response to a changing climate. And notice two things to notice: there are a lot of movement in the Western US that's very diffuse, but in the Eastern US, you get a lot of concentrated flow that's all running up the Appalachians. So we took that technology and we drove it down to a much, much finer scale, the kind of scale you could use to do conservation planning on. And the results of that was this map, where on this map, again, yellow is average, blue is above average, and brown is below average. And you can see all this concentrated flow and movement running up the Appalachians, even sometimes right along those thin little ridge lines, that are connecting the Central Apps to the High Allegheny and then up into the Northern Apps. And these are likely very critical places for the movement of nature in response to a changing climate. Just a word or two on how this map is made. It's built, it requires the building of a large, we call it a resistance grid. It's basically a grid of all the human modification features on the landscape at a fine scale, from energy, oil and gas wells, wind turbines, industrial agriculture, industrial forestry, major roads. And then on top of that, you build in the climatic gradients that are driven from the landscape, so northward or upslope or riparian corridors, and then you inject current and you follow how the current moves through the landscape as it sort of follows climatic gradients and avoids areas of high human modification, creating this map of potential important places for movement. And once again, the Central Apps just pops out as a key piece of the climatic corridor, keeping nature adaptable and moving. So we've actually integrated in the Nature Conservancy, we've integrated the resilient lands with the connectivity corridors into what we call the resilient and connected network. Here's a picture of it. And we've actually set our own goals towards trying to conserve that entire network as a place that would allow nature to move and thrive. And I think we have on the call maybe Katie Shallows and a few others that might be able to talk about it when we get to the Q&A, if you want to hear more about how we're trying to do that. But again, it comes down to natural areas and better managed land. All right, great. Well, I hope you're still with me. I hope I haven't lost you. I want to shift gears now to thinking about forests and carbon, the other real heart of the Central Apps. The Central Apps is one of the last remaining areas of temperate mixed forest in the world. And the loss of temperate mixed forest largely occurred in an era where we did not really understand the importance of carbon to our climate, nor did we understand the importance of trees to the sequestering of carbon. So I want to start by just backing up and looking really at what trees do and why that's so important. And a lot of the science I'm going to talk about right now has been done in the last 5 or 6 years. This is a very rapidly changing field, the field of carbon. But the first study I want to talk about was done hundreds of years ago And I have to say, until I read this study, I did not get carbon. Even though I had like memorized the carbon cycle and I learned about photosynthesis and grana and chloroplast and light reactions and dark reactions, it sort of took going back to the very first study. And what was done, this was John Baptist van Helmont in 1649. They were just asking the question, where does plant matter come from? And they did a very simple experiment, which I wish was being done in every elementary school in the country. They took a pot of soil and they weighed it carefully, 200 pounds, and into that pot they put a willow tree, 5 pounds. It's a sapling, a 5-pound willow sapling. They weighed them both. Then they waited 5 years. They watered the sapling, they watered it. And at the end of 5 years, they removed the sapling, which now weighed 169 pounds. And then they weighed the pot, and the pot weighed the same. And they were like, wait a minute, where did this 169, well, I guess you subtract 5, where did this 164 pounds of living plant material come from? And they wrongly decided it must have been something in the water that we were watering these plants with, and it took another 100 years before Joseph Priestley figured out, that the miracle really of photosynthesis, and that these plants are actually materializing out of the air. It's not a metaphor. They're extracting invisible carbon dioxide molecules out of the air around them and converting them into glucose and sugar, which becomes biomass. And so, although most people, I think that trees are growing up out of the ground, trees are actually materializing out of the air and growing down into the ground, and to really get your head around carbon, you have to start start getting that into your brain. Those fantastic forests of the Central Apps, literally came out of the air around them. And it's that ability of plants, to create biomass and matter out of the air is what reduced the amount of carbon in the air, over time. So how does this work? Let's take it, let's look at it. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Okay. So here is a tree on a bright, sunny day, blue sky. Remember, half of this tree is underground, over half usually. And the above ground part, you can think of it as a living solar collector. It's a living solar collector, and every leaf is a solar panel. And on a day like this, all those solar panels are out there, and each one is absorbing. They have their stomata open, and they're absorbing carbon dioxide, and they're splitting it, and they're splitting off the oxygen and releasing that, which is great because we breathe it. And then they're converting the carbon into sugars and transferring or storing it somewhere in the tree. So the key, one of the keys to understanding carbon, besides getting your head around how it works, is that the amount of carbon a tree can sequester is a function of the leaf area. It's just like a solar farm. How many panels do you have and how big are those panels? That's the limiting factor for absorption of carbon. So it doesn't have much to do with the size of the tree or the growth rate of the tree. It has to do with the leaf area of the tree. So this tree has a huge leaf area. But there's a little bit more to it because trees also breathe. They don't breathe, we don't call it breathing, we call it respiration. All living cells respire. All living cells respire. In our bodies, all our cells respire, and we collect, we organize all that respiration and we run it, through back and forth through our lungs, and we call it breathing. But in trees, every cell just respires freely. So there's carbon dioxide being given off by the tree, by the trunk, by the leaves, by the roots, and you have to subtract the amount of carbon dioxide being given off from the amount of carbon being taken in to get the actual amount. So the amount is The leaf area is how much is coming in. The respiration is how much goes out. And in most trees, the leaf area is way more than the respiration, the cost of respiration. Now, people thought for a while that maybe this slowed down as trees got older and larger, but that was really put to bed in 2014 with this meta study, of 673,000 trees, where the authors found that the leaf area index just way overshadows any change in the metabolic process. And they made this amazing statement, really, in a single year, a big tree can add the same amount of carbon to a forest as is contained as if you were growing an entire mid-sized tree. And again, that's just the leaf area. You can see the leaf area on this photo is almost like forests within themselves from the point of view of leaf area. Okay, so the tree, it's doing a number of other things. Another thing it's doing is it's monitoring its visual environment. So trees, our photoreceptors in our eyes we can see 4 types of light: red, blue, green, and light dark. Trees can see 11 types of light, and they have growth responses to all of those and metabolic process responses. And so they are constantly adjusting themselves to maximize the amount of leaf area and sunlight. So you couldn't design a better creature, for capturing carbon. It's exactly what the tree is designed to do. And as trees form forests, you get layers of plants, and those layers of plants start to maximize the whole amount of carbon that can be sequestered in a forest. So not just a single tree, but in a whole stand. And a lot of studies now have come out showing that the more structurally complex the forest is, the more leaf area you're getting, and the more carbon absorption you're getting, and it's more efficient. Again, it's the leaf area index, only it's now expanded to an entire stand. There is a limit, of course. This is all physics. It's not magic. Hopefully a stand reaches the maximum amount of carbon it can by maximizing its leaf areas at all different levels. Okay, so let's see, how are we doing? Okay, 5 more minutes here. So now we can answer the question, what is this hiker thinking? Awesome leaf area index. Look at that. It's got upper canopy, mid canopy, lower canopy. So this is a forest that's kind of functioning on all cylinders. But a big question that has come up in carbon science is, where does all this extra carbon go? Because it's clear that not all that carbon is going into growth. And that's what foresters have noticed for a long time. The growth slows down, but and for a while they thought the carbon sequestration slowed down, but it doesn't. It keeps at the same pace. But where is the carbon going? Well, only in the last 5 years, a wonderful study by Tamar Klein and her team, they got these cranes and they released labeled carbon in the upper canopy of some forests, and they could track how the forest absorbed that carbon and where it went. Where was it transferred to? And what they found, it came out in Science, and it kind of shook the science world, really. What they found when they traced the labeled carbon, first of all, most of it went pretty rapidly to the roots. So it was being transferred. It wasn't being put into above ground growth. It was being transferred to below ground growth. But then the real shocking thing was up to 40% of it was being shared with other trees in the forests. And these graphics here, these two looks like 2 trees holding hands. That's 2 trees connected by a mycorrhizal network sharing the carbon. And the forest is actually creating, it's now being understood that the forest creates a shared carbon pool, and the carbon actually moves back and forth in different times of the year. During the winter, the coniferous trees may transfer carbon to the deciduous trees, and vice versa in the summer. So you get this pool that's being mediated by mycorrhizal network. The mycorrhizal network is, a connected network of fungi that also eat carbon, and the trees are transferring carbon to that network to feed it. And that network is breaking down nutrients out of the soil and transferring those nutrients to the trees. So it's a very long, well-established relationship. I'm really psyched Suzanne Simmert is going to be speaking at one of these upcoming ones. She and her group have done amazing work here. Here's this kooky diagram is one of her diagrams of the network that forms around a mother tree, and she found that the old mother trees are the hubs of these carbon sharing networks, and that they'll even transfer a little extra carbon to their own offspring. So they're tracking their offspring, they're tracking their neighbors, and they're sharing carbon. I can't wait to hear her talk. So mycorrhizal networks are now, the hot topic in carbon science, and a lot of where the carbon is happening. I really also recommend this book, Entangled Life, by Merlin Sheldrake. It's a fantastic read on mycorrhizal networks. But there is good evidence now that, when forest is cleared, the mycorrhizal network degrades and less carbon is stored, and it takes time for that network to rebuild, and so the rebuilding, there's underground restoration that is tracking the above ground restoration. Forestry has really not yet fully embraced, that I can tell, soil carbon. It's happening in agriculture already, where you see a lot of regenerative agriculture that is starting to think about retaining carbon in the soils. I hope that hits the forest community just as much, because it's a critical piece of our forest systems. Here's a sheet for calculating forest carbon from 2016, and you can see the soil organic carbon is just a constant. It's just a constant. So we don't really know the dynamics of this yet. There's starting to be a lot more research on it, but I think a way to think about it, at least this is how I think about it. And if you haven't noticed already, I'm an ecologist. I'm not a carbon scientist, so I'm still trying to figure out how this all works ecologically, But the easiest way is that when a forest is young, it allocates most of its carbon to growth. So you see the forest growing rapidly. But as the forest ages and slows down, it allocates a lot more of its carbon below ground to its root system. And so you get just different allocations of carbon to these different carbon pools, above ground, below ground, or even to the coarse woody debris pool around it. And you get these changes in the pools. But over time, those old forests just accumulate centuries worth of carbon, and they do stay with the forest. And this was a little controversial for a while, but I think the controversial has died down. There are examples of old forests that are carbon sources, and most of that is related to disturbance, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Undisturbed forests just accumulate large amounts of carbon, most of it in the soil. This has huge implications for land conservation. I thought this paper that came out, Goldstein et al. About 3 years ago on irrecoverable carbon, they did this nice diagram of carbon density, how dense is the carbon, and then carbon stock, how big a stock is out there. So you can see temperate peatlands and mangroves, old forests, boreal peatlands. These are dense with carbon. They aren't that large of a stock globally, but the key is the circle surrounding these is the recovery time, how long it takes to regrow that carbon if you were to lose it. And it really starts to build an argument for we should not be losing carbon. We should be doing everything possible to keep carbon in our old forest, our mature forest, our peatlands, because if we lose it now, we're not going to get it back, in the next 50 or 60 years, which is our critical climate change years. So using the resilient land mapping tool, I ran the carbon, and this is done with Chris Williams' work, who's going to be speaking later today about how this model is made. It's an awesome model. It's on the mapping tool. You can calculate the amount of carbon for anywhere in in the country. And I just calculated it for the Central Apps forest carbon, and the estimated amount of carbon for 2010, so this would have been 10 years ago, was about 1.5 billion tons, 84.7 metric tons per acre. So the Central Apps is a big source of existing carbon stock. And according to Chris's model, most of that is in below ground carbon. So most of that is soil carbon with a decent chunk of above ground carbon too. So interesting statistic. All right, now I want to end by talking about sequestration. To me, this is the most confusing part of carbon. The stock stuff is pretty clear. The sequestration is tricky because when people talk about carbon storage, they're talking about the amount of carbon. And when they talk about sequestration, they're usually talking about the rate of carbon, or the rate of sequestration. How fast is carbon being removed from the atmosphere? However, for us and for climate change, we also really want to know the amount that is being taken out of the atmosphere, not just the rate. If you think of it as your bank account, it's not really how fast you put money in, it's also what is the amount that you're putting in. So that those two things get tangled up and for me, this gets into a very confusing topic. And the question I get asked the most is, do young, fast-growing forests sequester more carbon than mature or old forests? And I'll show you, the answer is no, but I want to show you, I finally found a study that really helped me fully understand it. And the study was done in Western Oregon in a thin pine forest. So it was not, I'll compare it for you to Eastern forests in a moment. Now, it was not as much of it doesn't sequester nearly the amount that an Eastern forest does. But what I loved about this study was two things. They measured every carbon pool and they measured every carbon flux. And they started with a very old forest, a 250-year forest, and then the exact same forest nearby that had been cut and was about 20-year forest. So it had been clear cut or cut heavily, is about 20 years old. And so you can really get a clear comparison between the carbon stocks and the carbon fluxes. And let me show you what they found out, because it's really eye-opening. So when you look at the carbon stock, it makes a lot of sense. The two carbon stocks are similar, except the trunk and the branches are gone from the young forest. The trunk and branches that are apparent in the old forest are gone because that's what was cut and taken away. Now, maybe it still exists out there as wood products, but that piece of the stock is gone. But notice there's a few other things. The soil carbon also went down. So in the cut forest, the soil carbon did degrade a little bit, by quite a bit actually. The woody debris went up. So that makes sense because there's more debris on the ground. And the carbon stocks are quite different. Notice also that the leaf area index changed. The leaf area index on the young forest is very low compared to the leaf area index on the old forest. So the next thing they did was they measured the fluxus, the carbon going in. And here you can see that the carbon going into the old forest, 472, that's grams per meter squared. And then in the young forest, 357. So less carbon being absorbed because it has a smaller leaf area index. But then the kicker was when they measured respiration. And in the old forest, the respiration from the soil and the existing stand was pretty high, 444. But when you subtract those two, it was sequestering about 28 grams per year, 28 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. When you went to the young forest, the respiration was 389. It was greater. It was greater than the amount coming in, which means this young forest is losing carbon. The leaf area index is not large enough to absorb enough carbon to offset the amount that's being lost from respiration. So it is a carbon source, it's not a sink. And the authors concluded that it takes about 20 or 30 years before the leaf area of a forest would be large enough to offset the respiration. So after a disturbance like a hurricane or a downburst or heavy cutting, the forest loses carbon until the leaf area gets back up to the point where it can offset its own respiration. Okay, these carbon stocks, as I said, were much smaller. This was a dry pine forest in Western Oregon. You know, ours are almost double that. You can look at these deciduous forests, we up in the 74 grams per meter squared compared to these 28. But still, I think the same processes apply in our eastern forests. So I'll end with sort of this is my general model that I use. I'm not sure it's 100% correct, but I think it's pretty close. You know, if you have an old forest, you have sort of a flat rate, steady state. When that forest is cut, there's a period of loss. So think there's a period of loss while the forest leaf area index has to regrow. The forest, the roots are still respiring, and the woody debris, you know, and it takes time before the leaf area index gets back up to the point where there's enough leaf area to offset the respiration. Yay, you know, and that may take 20 or 30 years. We'll say more about that in a second. But you're not quite carbon neutral yet, because now you have to pay the cost. You have to pay the cost of this respiration, and that may take another 20 years before now you are sequestering carbon. You're sequestering carbon, you know, every year, but you have to pay off your debt. And at a certain point, you know, maybe around 60 or 7, this is just a generalized graph here. You've paid off the debt of the lost carbon and you are carbon neutral. So you can get to this point where you can grow wood and be completely carbon neutral, you know, if you can get to this point where you've reached, you know, you've offset the losses from the early years and you're now gaining. And this is also the period when the rate of carbon sequestration is highest. So that's good. Okay. So it's carbon neutral, you've grown wood. The thing that you have not done is you haven't sequestered more carbon. And that's where you compare that to the undisturbed forest. It's just been steadily sequestering carbon every year. And there isn't any way really, you know, it's going to win the game. If you're playing a game between the two, it's going to win the game of carbon sequestration. I've run these numbers out. The main difference being all that carbon, most of it probably went to the root, went to the soil, you know, whereas in the neutral carbon, you didn't use any carbon, you created wood, but the wood had a carbon cost and you end up being neutral. So there isn't really any way to create there. Well, let me say one last thing, you know, there's a lot of give in this equation. So now you could start thinking, well, what if you didn't cut so hard so that you could get, and you left your mother trees on the ground? Maybe you could get to that neutral period much quicker, and then you could run it up, and then you could actually sequester it. So there's a lot of ways you could play with this to actually create a forest industry, you know, that was sequestering carbon and reaching neutral point much quicker. And you can also think about what happens to the harvested wood and make sure we keep, you know, I myself love wood and paper and I use it, you know, are there ways to keep it in the system? So there's a lot of play, but the play hopefully needs to be based on the most current science so that we really get this right, because we are faced with a crisis where trees can really, really help us. So let's just end by looking at the potential again using Chris's model, you know, which is, I would say, not realistic, but he'll talk about this later, you know. But what he does is it runs the model out to 2050. So if there was no disturbance at all, you know, how much new carbon could you potentially gain in the Central Apps? And you can look at that here and see that it's about 225 million tons of new carbon could be sequestered. It's about 5.6 million tons a year, you know, and a lot of that would be in above ground growth. It'd be a mixture. So potentially there's a lot of future carbon, you know, could be sequestered in these forests. All right, so in summary, my summary, if you can remember this, all, the Central Apps are a center for resilience, biodiversity, and endemism due to their physical properties. And those properties will likely last under many different climates. The Appalachians themselves define a critical climate corridor that's important for allowing populations to move and shift in response to the climate change. The current forests of the Central Apps contain over 1 billion tons of carbon, much of which is not recoverable over the next 50 years if it were to be lost. And then finally, the Central Apps could potentially sequester over 5 million tons of carbon every year based on the existing forests. So thanks for taking this time. Thanks for spending this time and listening to my rant here. I encourage you to look. You can look at all these data sets. You can explore the Central Apps. You can look at the geodiversity, the microclimate diversity, and the carbon on this resilient land mapping tool, maps.tnc.org, resilient land. And I also point you on the same website. There's a document we're calling Managing for Resilience, where we're really trying to work out what are the ways to manage to increase the inherent resilience of nature. And it's authored by a lot of stewardship staff from the Conservancy. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was really fascinating and great way to begin our symposium. We do have, and I will say, I have used that tool you just referenced at the end and echo that it's awesome and it's very easy to use. Just upload a shapefile and you're on your way. But we do have quite a few questions for you.
Great.
I'll get us started. First question was looking back to the general model you shared pretty late in your presentation. Could you explain a little further what you think is happening at the change in the rate at 20 years post-harvest? So it looks like there's a change in the slope of the line of carbon sequestration at year 20 post-harvest. Could you maybe comment on what's causing that change at that point in time?
Yes, Ryan. So if I understand the question, I think the change in rate it's the growth of the leaf area. So, when trees are small, even if they're growing fast, their leaf area starts out very small, but rapidly, trees are fractal, rapidly the leaf area starts to increase fractally, and that creates a rapid increase in the absorption of carbon. So the quicker the leaf area returns, the quicker the carbon is absorbed. So I think that's what creates that steeper sloped line.
Okay, thank you. I think you definitely addressed that. Another question we had from the audience is kind of looking at your information broader beyond just the Central Apps and asking whether the microclimate diversity model you talked about early in your presentation is more broadly applicable, specifically to coastal regions.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that question, whoever asked that. We have applied it in coastal regions, and here's how I would say, it's a matter of scaling it to a much flatter landscape. So the landscape as a whole has gentler topography and much less dramatic changes. But I think if you account for that, there are still many very important areas in the coastal landscape that they're created by river systems. A lot of them are created by river systems or foothills or erosion areas where you're getting a lot of microclimatic diversity. It's just all scaled down. And we've identified a lot of river systems really come out as important because they're creating a lot of that microclimate diversity in the coastal areas. So hopefully that answers that.
I think so. Pivoting back to the Central Apps now for this third question. Someone is interested in forest type. Specifically, you presented a lot of kind of general trends with respect to leaf area index and carbon sequestration over time, but the question asks, would conversion to one forest type or another affect carbon sequestration and storage?
Yeah, actually, there's some good work on this, and I don't have it on the top of my head. There's some general trends, if these are helpful. You know, the broadleaf forests are usually sequester a lot more than coniferous forests. Coniferous forests can sequester carbon throughout the winter, but it doesn't quite make up. Their leaf area is small because they've got needles, you know, and they can't quite compete with those broadleaf areas, but they do go year round. But that's one general trend. I'd be happy, there's some good resources on it, Ryan, and I'd be happy to dig those up and send them back to you later, as we can share that with the audience.
Yeah, I think that would be a great next step there. Like I said, we got a lot of questions, so I'm trying to collapse some of them here. But another question is thinking back to young forests versus old forests. And so in the data you presented, you know, it appeared primarily to be means, averages that you were discussing. So this question asks whether it's possible that respiration or CO2 loss in young forest may be very sensitive or likely to spike because of its sensitivity to precipitation and water availability, because young forests have fewer, presumably, roots and mycorrhizal networks. So in other words, I wonder if that estimate of young forest respiration could even be an underestimate because of their extreme potential for variable respiration rates due to not having a lot of root biomass.
That's an interesting question. That seems logical. So that question seems logical, but in the study that I highlighted, a lot of that initial respiration was actually from the root mass that was still in the ground from the previous harvest. So I'm not sure I can answer it without more thought. You know, it's a mixture of the respiration of the new fast-growing trees, which I think that question's about, which is important. But I also think there is also remnant root systems and mycorrhizal networks that are in the soil that are also respiring. So it's some combination of those two things.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a mind twister a little bit too. So kind of we're moving around a lot with these questions, but here's kind of a big picture question. Thinking about the carbon that is currently stored in the Central Apps ecoregion that you drew out, do we know what amount of that or proportion of that is in protected places?
I don't, but that I could calculate that. We could calculate that very easy. So I'd be happy to calculate that and send that out too. I don't know maybe there's somebody on this call who knows what proportion of the Central Apps is under conservation. Yeah, but that would be easy to calculate. So good question. Maybe I should say not enough.
That's a good answer. Okay. Another question here that we have is about thinking about the biodiversity patterns you opened with. And you know, in those data, it seemed to be data reflecting vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, just biodiversity. So this question, I think, is inspired by the pivot to mycorrhizae and below ground considerations. What happens to that? What does that data look like spatially if you start talking about below ground biodiversity? Does it follow the same pattern?
Oh, good. I like these questions. I don't know. I would love to know what that below ground biodiversity pattern looks like. I would love to know that. I don't know. I've never seen it. I don't know if it's out there.
Okay.
That's when, ask Suzanne Simmert at your next conference, ask her that question.
I will.
Yeah.
Let's see. This is I think we have time for one last question, and it's a forestry question. Is the 20 to 30 years after a cut, is it the 20 to 30 years after a cut that forests are carbon sources, assuming that it was a clear cut? How would a variable retention harvest compare to a clear cut in those decades? And also, how about a shelter wood harvest? So I think they're asking about different types of cutting and how that would affect those trajectories for carbon.
Yes, thank you for that question. Great question. I don't know all the answers to those questions, but I think they matter a lot, So I think the pattern of cutting a shelter wood cut or a cut where you're explicitly leaving some of the older trees on the landscape and thinking about the pattern of the cut, I think those can make a huge difference. The leaf area does not drop as far, like that was a clear cut in that example, so you could keep the leaf area index from dropping as far, and you could also be retaining the mycorrhizal network to the best that you can, and really thinking that out. And I think there's ways, I hope, I'm glad there's foresters, thinking about this, because I think there's ways to really improve forestry, thinking about carbon, and still get wood and paper products.